Hi, I'm Sam Redondo, a licensed therapist and embodiment coach, and I want to welcome you to the Spiritual Embodiment Podcast, where we explore where our why meets our what, or said in another way, exploring the intersection of embodiment and spirituality. And gosh, I'm so excited to be with you all today and really wanted to talk about this idea of movement as medicine. Oh, there's so much there. Even just thinking about that phrase, movement as medicine, I imagine brings up some experiences for you in your memory, maybe of ways that movement has not felt like medicine, that's felt hard or painful or even impossible. Maybe even memories of when movement has felt so good, so satisfying, so empowering. We really have a lot in our relationship with movement. And so, even just as I say that, I invite you to notice what comes up for you. Hearing movement is medicine. Maybe that's true to your experience, maybe it's not. But nonetheless, I think it's important for us to talk about and explore and lean into what movements could be medicine for us, what movements could feel good, feel satisfying, feel cathartic even, and really help us on our not only our healing journey, but also our spiritual path as well. So I had a recent experience of getting to participate in an embodiment training led by Dr. Hilary McBride, which I've mentioned some of her work before. She is a PhD psychologist, therapist, and just expert on embodiment and how to be with our bodies, how to experience our life through our body. And I was privileged enough over the last few months to get to learn from her, and then to have that was virtual over Zoom, and then to have a weekend up in Vancouver, Canada, where I got to, with a group of others, just do some experiential embodiment work. And gosh, it was so impactful, so meaningful, and really learned a lot about my own body, my own experience of being a body, but also how to lead others into these experiences as well. And one of the things that I think is so important to name is just this idea, which I'm borrowing from Hilary, that the body is the place where the experience of being a person is happening. So my body is the place where my life happens. And we've kind of touched on this idea before on this podcast, but I think it's important to mention again because sometimes when we think about movement or working out, it can feel like this thing that is separate from us, that is other than us, that like we have to do, we have to perform, we have to accomplish in order to be healthy or lose weight or, meet some sort of societal standard, when movement is so much bigger than a workout. Movement is so much bigger than even an expression or like one type of movement. It encompasses our whole body's life, our whole experience of being a body. And embodiment often looks like attuning or listening to or being aware of our body's movements. And so I wanted to just kind of present this framework today for us to think about movement in a new way. That movement can be us just observing our body's natural rhythms. So often we don't think about kind of the autonomic nervous system or automatic movements that our body does, such as breathing, that like we don't have to think about, such as digestion, these things that our bodies do without us having to think or plan, or our brain send a signal, hey, move this muscle. It's innate. It's part of just our body's survival systems. And so sometimes movement can look like just attuning to these natural ways our body is moving. So if you are like me and have done yoga practices, meditation as part of, your movement practice, your spiritual practice, your mental health support, you've probably done some sort of exercise around attuning to your breath. Maybe it's slowing down, taking a deeper breath, noticing how your chest and belly expand with your inhale, noticing how they contract with your exhale. And this is just a small way that we can attune to our body's automatic movements. Another one that's interesting that Hillary actually led us through in this training was paying attention or attuning to our heartbeat in a place other than our chest, which for me was fascinating because I'd never done something like that before. And often when we think about attuning to our heartbeat, it's like putting a hand on our chest or noticing our heart beating within our chest, or maybe we take our pulse in our neck or our wrist. And she invited us to, not check our pulse, not attune to our chest, but maybe find another place in the body like the foot or the leg or the arm where we could sense our heartbeat. And that is actually one of the kind of measures that scientists have come up with who are studying embodiment and trying to find ways to kind of track the level of embodiment that people possess. And sensing into our heartbeat is one of the measures that scientists have used to measure embodiment, which I think is so cool. And so that is one of the ways that we can sense into our body's automatic movements is our heart. It's beating, it's moving, it's expanding and contracting those muscles to pump blood through our body to keep us alive. And so that's just another way, another system we can attune to movement. Maybe outwardly our body looks still, but there's still movement happening. Another great one is like digestion. Maybe if you've ever meditated before, you are still and you can kind of sense into, okay, what's my body doing? And you're like, wow, there's like all this gurgling, or there's, even like liquid moving around, or you kind of sense a fluttering or a buzzing in your system, in your core. And, our digestive system is working, even if we're not aware of it, even if we're not noticing it. And so those are some ways that we can attune to our body's natural movements, automatic movements that, maybe aren't outwardly as expressive, but are still true. Even in stillness, the body is moving. Another thing I wanted to mention is that movement is one of the most efficient ways to release stress in our body. And so stress is not what's happening to us, right? Like it's not the email from our boss on a Friday afternoon. It's not the person who cut us off in traffic. Those we would describe as stressors, but stress is the biological cascade of reactions that happen when we're confronted with a stressor. And so, stress looks like cortisol, adrenaline, some of the hormones that get activated in our body. It looks like our blood moving from our core, where digestion is happening and all of that, to our extremities, to our limbs, where we're ready to fight or flight. We're ready to run. We're ready to punch. We're ready to have some bigger muscle movements, because in order to face the stressor, in order to accomplish the task that we're required to do to, quote, survive that situation. And so movement, working out, any sort of like bigger muscle movement is the most efficient way to release all of that survival energy, all of those stress hormones through our system, through our body, and find that relief and rest on the other side. And so this is kind of the science behind why we feel good after a workout. Those endorphins are going, why we feel like tired, but like, oh yes, like that sense of relief, that sense of release. That is because it's the most efficient way to move stress through our system. There's other ways we can move stress through our system: connection, co-regulation, creativity, a big old cry. These can include movement or not, but I think it's important to mention that, movement is kind of our body's most natural, most innate way to deal with stress. And I kind of mentioned this before, but I also want to mention like movement doesn't have to be big motor movement or athletic. Often when we think of movement, we think of like going for a run or doing a workout class or jumping on the Peloton or, doing Zumba, like these kind of big body movements. And honestly, like in my work as an embodiment coach and as a somatic therapist, sometimes the smaller movements, those like micro movements, I like to call them, can be some of the most relieving, relaxing things that our body wants to do and how our body wants to express stuck trauma, stuck stress, really just express whatever it's holding. And in my work, often micro movements can look like just a gentle kind of sway of the hips or figure eight of the hips that's maybe not even perceptible on the outside. If someone were observing you, maybe you're sitting on the bus or you're at work, they wouldn't even be able to tell you're moving. But it's just that small, gentle rock back and forth, or maybe it's the scrunching and releasing of the toes in your shoes. But some of these movements can be just what we need, just what our body is like craving and wanting to do. And that is movement. I just want to validate like that is movement too. And I think one of the things I love to do when working with movement in a session is playing with the size and the kind of span of the movement. Make the movement bigger and see if that feels good. Make the movement as small as you can and see what that feels like. And then maybe find a place in the middle of those two. And what feels good for you today? Does it feel good to take up all the space in the room, to spread as far as you can? Or does it feel good to kind of just like keep that movement really small and perceptible just for you, or maybe somewhere in between? And I think, often we're conditioned with the cultural expectations of movement being these like bigger athletic or like even like skilled expert movements. We see athletes on TV and we're like, oh, that's what it looks like to move your body. But sometimes, dropping into our own body's experience and sensing into what actually feels good and satisfying about this movement, how big, how small, what kind of movement, slow or fast, playing with some of these dials of span and size, of speed, even of like different, how much space we're taking up, how small a space we're taking up. Those can be really great practices for playing with movement. And I want to name here too that movement is the language of our body. We already talked about how the body is the place where our life happens, but movement is our body's expression. It's the language, the words that our body says, this is the message I'm sending. This is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm holding. This is my experience. It can tell us wisdom. It can tell us a story. Movement can start a conversation. One of my favorite things is when you're on the dance floor. If you've ever, danced at a wedding, been at a school dance, maybe been in a dance class or some sort of dance workshop, and you make eye contact with someone, maybe it's your partner, maybe it's your friend, and you guys just start vibing. Like you just start kind of like mirroring each other's movements. For me, what comes to mind is one of my best friends in college, Kelly. We both love to dance. We're like not that skilled, I would say. Like we're both two white girls who have like a little bit of rhythm, but it was just something about the expression of dance we both loved. And so our school was small enough, small liberal arts college, that we still had school dances in college. And I just remember this one dance. We were like on the outskirts of, everyone clumped in the middle, dancing, dance circles. And we were like on the far side of the gym. Like it's totally dark. It's not even the dance floor. It's just like the gym floor at this point. going so hard, like vibing with each other, eye contact, like doing crazy movements, mirroring each other. Like we were just in it, drenched in sweat, barefoot. Like we were not cute. We were like the girls whose makeup was gone because we had sweat so much, eyeliner running down our cheeks, hair damp. Like people asked us if we had gone and jumped in the pool that was next to the gym because we were so sweaty. And it's one of my favorite memories because it was just like we were so embodied, so in our bodies, connected to each other, having the time of our lives, just like expressing whatever was in us at 20 years old, 19 years old. And, movement can be a way that our body tells a story and even connects. There was such a connection, an attunement between me and her, this kind of like reciprocal back and forth of like, I'm going to do this move. Are you going to do that? Oh, you're doing that move. Okay. I'm going to do that move too. And like, there's such a playfulness that can happen with movement, whether it's dancing, like in this story with Kelly, or even I think about like my experience as an athlete, being a volleyball player, and kind of the chemistry that can happen on the court, where with like a look or a movement, you can communicate what's next, and your body, you shift into one place and your teammate comes and fills the spot that you were at. And there's kind of this like collective movement that can happen. And I've seen this in the work I do, like in workshops where, we're moving our bodies. Maybe we're doing yoga together or dance or more intuitive movement. And there comes a point where there's kind of this collective group experience of breath or of kind of moving our bodies in a similar way, where it feels like the group is now leading. Like it's not me prompting people. It's not, the teacher in the front. It's the group kind of responding innately to each other. And so movement really can be a way that we attune to others, that we kind of like connect with our community in some of these ways, which is so rad and so cool. And I think that's like the magic of movement, when we can drop into spaces where we have that collective movement experience and can kind of communicate in ways other than words, just with our bodies, with our breath, with kind of our relationship to each other without having to say anything. And I think I've been lucky enough to have experiences of attunement in those spaces, whether it's on a dance floor or in a yoga class or in kind of a movement breathwork experience, where, man, it's like I just feel so seen and so a part of something that is so different than having a deep conversation. It just lands differently in my body and my system. That feels really connective and really like, oh, I'm seen, I'm known, I'm a part of something, which is so, so cool. Another thing I wanted to mention, David Mars talks about the 7 channels of experience. And what he names these as is sensation, emotion, energy, or what we could think of as like a numinous felt sense of like something outside of us that we can sense and feel, maybe, not tangible. Movement, auditory, what we can hear, visual, what we can see, and imaginal. So kind of like what's in our imagination, our mind's eye. And so these 7 channels of experience are how we experience the world, how we move through the world, how we express ourselves to other people, in our life, in the world. And I think, a lot of them have to do with the body, and movement is one of these core channels. And so I think when we can access this channel of experience, when we are attuned to our body's movements, it opens up a whole new world of what it's like to be us, a whole new kind of language of what it's like to be us. And I think for me, as someone who is an Aries, is a former athlete who still does somewhat athletic things, I think, and at this point, if you listen to my other episodes, a bit of my story, someone who had early body trauma, being a premature baby. But I think someone who's always like been pretty embodied for the most part, minus some of those spiritual times that took me out of my body through church and cult situations. That if you're curious about more of this, go listen to my story in my episodes 2 and 3. But as someone who's always been pretty attuned to my body's experience, movement, I can't even imagine my life without movement. I can't imagine my spiritual practice. I can't imagine my relationship with myself and even my relationship with others without movement. You know, one of the ways that my husband and I, when we were dating and like getting to know each other, was through running and hiking and being outside and playing volleyball and pickleball and swimming in the ocean, like just being in our bodies together. And that's still one of the ways that we really relate and connect. And when our connection is rocky or we're feeling like there's stuff going on, that's always a way that I can return to us, return to like what's good about our relationship. Is like, oh, we just need to move together. Like we need to do a workout together. We need to get outside together. And I think I've just seen how movement can be so powerful for, you know, connecting with myself, connecting with others, being connected to my own life force energy, my own aliveness, and really as like a return to self. You know, if I'm not feeling myself, I'm feeling disconnected, depressed, like movement is one of the ways back for me. And so I think David Marr's 7 channels of experience is a helpful framework for me to think through, is because movement is like one of the ways back to my own experience. And so even for those of us where movement is hard, you know, I had an episode recently on chronic pain and illness and when being a body doesn't feel good. And so that's why I wanted to name some of these like micro movements, even attuning to our body's autonomic movements, can be a way that we engage with this experience of movement, this channel of experience, without having to have those like big aggressive motor movements, you know, that might be exhausting for some of us, that might actually be impossible for some of us, depending on, you know, your experience of being a body. And so I wanted to just expand maybe our conceptualization of movement to include, you know, stillness, to include micro movements, because it doesn't have to be this big athletic thing to be really, really good. So next I wanted to talk about this idea of linear versus non-linear movements. So when we think of linear movement, it's probably a lot of the stuff we think of with movement, right? So it's like any sort of movement that is kind of in a straight line. So going for a walk, running, even yoga, you know, we're doing a little bit of non-linear, but it's also like we're moving through a series of poses that often are guided in a linear way, you know, in a way that's kind of like systemized and organized and makes sense. Whereas nonlinear movement might look more like interpretive dance, might look more like, you know, Tai Chi in a way. Tai Chi is like a little bit kind of like yoga. It can be linear, but it kind of leans more nonlinear. Even like some floor yoga where you're just moving your body in a way that feels good and just like intuitive. My husband always argues this one, which I'm like, it's a little bit of both, but he's like, trail running is nonlinear. You know, you're having to kind of like be creative, be spontaneous, you know, like adjust to the trail as you're moving at high speed. You know, maybe there's a rock, maybe there's a snake, maybe the trail twists in a way you didn't anticipate. And so you're kind of like in that more active, engaged response to the trail and to what's happening versus just like running on a sidewalk or running on the road where you're kind of just doing the same thing over and over. So yeah, that's one where we have a bit of a debate about it. But I'm like, yeah, there's definitely some non-linearness to trail running for sure. And, I think I mentioned this, but like dance, which is one of the ways that I love moving non-linearly, where you're just allowing your body to flow. If it's like a choreographed dance, that might fall more into some like linear categories, like we said with yoga. But any sort of like intuitive movement that you're letting your body move in lots of different directions, flow in a way that is creative and spontaneous and responsive, that falls into this non-linear space. And why this distinction is important is because our brains and our bodies need both. So linear movement is kind of a way that our body can get that bilateral stimulation. So like this is why going for our little mental health walks is so helpful. You're getting both the left and right side of your brain are activated, and going back and forth between the left and right side of your body and your brain is soothing for your nervous system and is stimulating in the best way for your brain. Linear movement can also help us to feel some expertise, some skill, some like accomplishment, like, oh, I got this, some muscle memory. Like if you start running, you're like, oh, this is hard. I'm not good at this. You run for a few weeks and then you are like, oh, I can actually go further and I feel better than before. Okay. There's like a sense of accomplishment there. And to contrast, nonlinear movement gets us into that like playful network of our brain. It activates our creativity. It can bring in a lot of storytelling and meaning making that linear movement doesn't really touch. Nonlinear movement also can bring up a lot of emotion because, we're really sensing into our body's kind of innate expression. And so you've maybe experienced this in like a yoga class, or if you've done any dance sort of movement where you're moving your body in a certain way, especially maybe like your hips or your low back, and you're like, whoa, like I have tears coming to my eyes, or I have anger coming up, where kind of an emotion unlocks in the movement. And so nonlinear movement kind of helps us to tap into that more easily than linear movement does, at least in my experience. And so, I'm a big believer of like, we need both in our movement practice to experience the full range of what it means to be a body through movement. And I also wanted to just name that movement can be spiritual practice. And I think this is something that, as like growing up and having a lot of experience in the evangelical Christian church, movement was not really seen that way. I think in kind of more like traditional contemplative traditions, movement is like, there's a lot of like walking prayers, there's a lot of like chanting that happens in some of these denominations that maybe we experience as more contemplative or more liturgical. And then on the other side, in some of the like more charismatic or even like spiritual or new age organizations or groups, movement is like part of worship. It's part of expression. It's part of like cathartic release in these spiritual ways, or even, I'm thinking about some of the cults that I've studied, or that use, not everyone who uses this is a cult, but that's what came to mind, that use kind of the like ecstatic dance. So use dance to work themselves up into a state of spiritual ascent, of release, of kind of this like big emotional experience, or, spiritual experience really is what they're trying to get. And I'd say like similarly in my experience at Bethel and the charismatic church, there was a lot of like moving your body in ways to like have a spiritual experience, whether it was dancing, whether it was the like physical manifestations that I've talked about in this podcast before. And I think those expressions can be so beautiful and so harmful. And so my experience of movement in some of these ways, it's a little bit of both. Recently I've been kind of rediscovering dance in part of my movement practice, but also like I'm curious about it as spiritual practice as well. I danced growing up, ballet, tap, jazz, before I got into volleyball in about fifth grade. So when I was like elementary school age, did some dance and liked moving my body in that way. And then started playing volleyball and didn't dance anymore. But I kind of came back to it once I started becoming a member of more charismatic churches, and dance was more like an accepted part of worship. And I really found it as a way I love to express like my worship, express what was in my heart to God, and found myself in the church I went to in college, just like in the back behind all the pews. We're a very like pew-like congregation, but we met in a Korean Presbyterian church, I believe, on Sunday afternoons. So they would meet in the mornings and then we'd come in the afternoon and use their space. But behind all the pews, I would just dance in the back during worship, and it was very intuitive and expressive. And people asked me like, oh, do it in the front, like it's so powerful or beautiful. And I was like, no, like this is for me and for God, like it's not for other people. But that was something that like I really loved to do. And then when I went to Bethel, they would have like these dancers on stage, but they were like professional dancers. Like they did a lot of the like modern intuitive dance, but I didn't feel like I was on that level. So I kind of stopped dancing because I felt like in that space, it was a bit more performative, even though it was still quote worship. It just didn't feel as like kind of like grassroots and authentic as it did at this other church. And so slowly I kind of stopped dancing. It became less and less a part of my spiritual practice. And part of this training I did with Hillary this last weekend, which this wasn't the first time I've done this with her, but she facilitated a 5 rhythms dance workshop for us while we were there. And 5 rhythms, I'm still learning about it. So by no means am I an expert or like have all the training in it, but it's essentially a dance therapy practice where you move through 5 rhythms. So it's, I believe, intuitive, staccato, chaos, lyrical, and stillness are the 5 rhythms. And it's about an hour long. We did it for 2 hours, so it can be either, but you're just kind of allowing your body to move in the ways it wants to move. You're attuning to your own experience and also attuning to the people around you and kind of the group experience as you dance. And kind of contrasting with my experience of dance before in the church, it was always really lovely at my small church when I was in college. But I think when I went to Bethel, when I did dance, because it's not like I didn't dance at all, but it felt like this really big expression, like this really overwhelming experience. And I've talked about this with worship in these charismatic churches before, where it felt like a lot of flooding, a lot of emotion, like really cathartic, big experience, kind of like I was mentioning with that ecstatic dance. And then just like you're exhausted after, and it's kind of this like almost like martyrdom thing of like, oh, I like left it all out for the Lord. I just gave everything I have, and now I'm an empty vessel. And contrasting it with that experience, my experience of 5 rhythms is because you're moving almost through like this wave of experience where you're starting slower, you're really attuning to your body, you're really noticing what you need, what your body's wanting, how it wants to move, how it wants to express. And you're kind of like rising up into this chaos rhythm, this like faster, more intense movement. And then you're invited to soften into that and then kind of like fall down the rest of the wave into lyrical and stillness. It felt so containing for me. It felt like this really natural, kind of titrated expression, that where like it felt like I could ease into it and have a big experience and have a lot of expression and emotion, and then come back down the wave into more integration, into stillness, into just like a softer landing, I guess, where the experience didn't feel overwhelming. It didn't feel flooding. It didn't feel like I was just wiped out and like had to crash for the rest of the day afterwards, like it used to in these church settings. So yeah, maybe some of that is like my own growth and my own nervous system regulation, but I really do think a practice like 5 Rhythms where you're really guided and it's really trauma informed. There's a lot of choice. There's a lot of connecting with self. There's a lot of noticing and attunement happening with self, but also with the group and with the leader. That just wasn't the case in these other spiritual environments where dance was a part of it. And so, yeah, I think it's been so cool to rediscover dance as part of my spiritual practice, as part of my like mental health and emotional health practice. And like, it's a workout. Like I burned 400 calories in that 45 minutes that I did that practice. Like it was great. Thank you Apple Watch for recording that for me. But I really do think like moving our bodies in these ways that feel good for us, that feel authentic, that feel satisfying, that feel like, oh yeah, that's it. Like that feels good, is so important. And so that is like when we're thinking about movement as spiritual practice, that is my encouragement. It's like find something that feels good, that feels satisfying, that feels like, yes, this is the way my body wants to express itself. It's reminding me, my sweet parents, they're in their 70s and they recently discovered Tai Chi, and they are like, my dad was like a triathlete when he was younger, even his 40s. My mom has always been athletic and active, love to walk and hike and all these things. And as they've gotten into their 70s, like it's been a little harder to do these like bigger motor movement things. They're still going to the Y and working out. They're still swimming. But they started doing Tai Chi together every day on YouTube, which is the cutest. And they love it. It's like they're finding so much meaning, and they feel like they have more energy, like their bodies feel really good. And that's such a beautiful practice. And so I think, even naming like that our movement practice can shift and change across the lifespan. Like, I don't know if I'll still be doing dance practice in my 70s, but there was definitely some gray-haired people in my workshop today that, I don't know how old they are, but I'm assuming they are in their later years of life. And so it was so cool to see that dance can still be, these bigger movements can still be a part of our practice even as we age. And I also think, when we think about movement, obviously like workouts and like moving our body in these more maybe like intense or, building muscle, building our cardio, building, more capacity for our hearts and our breathing, are also a part of that. And so, my encouragement is like find movement that you enjoy. If you hate running, running's probably not the movement that you need to have as part of your practice. There's other ways to get cardio. There's other ways to move that feel good, that feel satisfying. And even playing with some of these like linear versus nonlinear, smaller micro movements versus big, muscle movements. Lifting weights feels really different than cardio. And so maybe even connecting into like, what is the energy of the kind of movement I want to do today? Like maybe I'm trying to set boundaries, or maybe like a lot of stress has been here and I just need to like lift something heavy. Sometimes tapping into our energy can really help us to connect with what kind of movement would feel most satisfying for my body today. I mentioned trying a mix of linear and nonlinear movements. Maybe that means like one day you're going for a run, the next day you're dancing, the next day you're doing yoga, the next day you're lifting weights. Like you can try on these different combination of things and see what fits for you. I also think it's important to mention trying things that are both kind of pushing your comfort zone, but match your level of ability. And so, to like, again, think of my parents with Tai Chi, they've never really done yoga. Like, sure, they'll dance at a wedding, but like they're not, that nonlinear movement is like not their comfort zone. But it's matching their level of ability, and they're actually like really enjoying it. It's really satisfying for them. And so maybe trying some things that like you're not used to, you wouldn't have tried before. That novelty is really good for our brains, you know, to move our body in a way that we're not used to, we haven't done before, can feel unfamiliar, can feel uncomfortable. You know, in this 5 rhythms workshop I did, there were definitely people who were like, this is so outside of my comfort zone. I have never done this before. They might never do it again, but they still showed up and did it and moved their body in a novel way, which, you know, I'm sure they had their own experience, you know, and learned so much about themselves through that. So I think finding those things that are pushing our comfort zone, but also matching our level of ability is really important, especially if we want to grow and expand in the amount of movement we can do, you know, in the types of movement we can do, to not, you know, totally exceed our level of ability so we burn out or we can't move the next day. But also to not just do the same thing over and over because that's what's comfortable. And if this looks like, you know, I mentioned some dance things that are like maybe in more of a structure, like in a worship service or in a 5 rhythms workshop, but sometimes like just turning on your favorite music and dancing in your kitchen while you make dinner is what the movement practice needs to be for the day. So I just want to validate, like, all movement is movement. Like, it's all expression. It's all good. It's all ways that you can connect with your body. You can connect with others. You know, one of my favorite things is like, if I'm having a little dance party in the kitchen and like my dog comes in and she's like, what's going on, mom? And then we're like playing and dancing. Then my husband comes in and like, we're all kind of having a moment of movement together. That's really connecting. That's like, oh, it can just help you like drop into the relationship in a way that's different from like language and having to like ask a question or think of words or talk about your experience. You just get to express your experience through your body. And lastly, I just want to name something that Hillary shared with us is this idea that health is not, you know, this inflexible, immobile, permanent maintenance of a desired state. You know, and another way to say this is like, we see this a lot in like wellness and health kind of like influencers and cultures and media of like the ideal body or the ideal workout plan or the ideal nutrition plan, of like there's this certain type of body, this certain way of being in your body, this certain way of moving that is like the idealized way to be. That's not health. We often get sold that as health from the wellness industry, but health is a person's ability to move and self-regulate as the situation requires. And so a lot of this is like connected to our nervous system, connected to our body's automatic responses of like, if I'm threatened all of a sudden, you know, like a bear comes barging into my house, like I want to be able to move my body in a way that I can survive that situation. And so practicing moving our body in these different ways, linear and nonlinear, prepares us to be able to move and self-regulate as a situation requires. Now, we don't have wild animals chasing us a lot of the time in our day-to-day life, but you know, we have the email from our boss, we have the person who cut us off in traffic, we have the argument with our partner, and often we don't have ways to move and self-regulate and express through our bodies built into that, right? Like if I'm being chased by a bear, my body's like, run away. Or if I can't run away, fight back. Like there's these just intuitive ways to move my body to survive. If I run away from my husband or try to fight him while we're in an argument, like both of those probably won't go over well. Like that is not actually what's needed to repair the relationship. But like I might practice some of that and move some of that energy through my body in my dance practice or in my run the next day. And so I think it's really important to name like movement, again, back to stress, back to emotion. Like movement is the way that our body can release and restore and regulate through what's needed in our life, through the ways we have to show up in maybe some more like contained, socially acceptable, polite ways throughout our life, when like the mammal part of our body, the animal body that we live in, is like, rah, like I wanted to scream at that person. I wanted to claw their face. I wanted to run away as fast as I could. I wanted to push them. And it's like we can't do those things that our body wants to do to survive some of these high stress situations, but we can reenact some of that response, some of that survival skill in our movement practices. So that is what I wanted to leave you with, that health is our ability to move and self-regulate as the situation requires. And so I invite you to maybe ask yourself this week, what is movement that feels good to me in this season? Or even, what is movement that feels good to me today? Maybe it is stillness while attuning to your breath or attuning to your pulse. Maybe it's some big muscle movements, like I need to go for a run or jump on the treadmill or the Peloton or dance my ass off in my kitchen. So what is movement that feels good to me? And maybe also ask yourself, do I tend to lean towards linear movement or nonlinear movement? And what might it look like to try the other one on? Or maybe you have a good balance of both, which is great. And another question you could ask yourself is, how can I incorporate movement into my spiritual practice? Maybe it's movement you're already doing, but you practice more awareness of your connection with self, or your connection with others, with nature, with God, with the more than human world. Maybe it's, looking up a practice or trying on an old practice like I did with dance, of a walking meditation, of yoga as spiritual practice, of dance as spiritual practice, movement as prayer, as worship. Maybe there's something from your history that's speaking to you that you want to reclaim and bring back from, maybe it got left in that season of life that was religious or in a high control community. And maybe you want to, to use a Christian word, redeem it. Maybe you want to bring it into the season of life and make it your own again. So I hope you find ways to move that feel good and satisfying and authentic for you this week. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Samantha Redondo, and I'll see you next time.